Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm going to explore the topic of behavioral contagion. This is an idea that we all intuitively understand, namely that we often take our cues for how to behave from other people. Behaviour is quite simply contagious. We know from a young age that falling in with the wrong crowd can influence our behaviour for the worse. My guest on this episode has just published a new book on this very topic. Robert Frank is the H.J. Louis Professor of Management and Professor of Economics at Cornell University's Johnson Graduate School of Management. In his new book, Under the Influence, he explores how our environments encourage smoking, bullying, tax cheating, sexual predation, problem drinking, and wasteful energy use. By understanding how our behaviour is contagious, we can find ways to solve some of the biggest issues facing our society. We recorded this episode prior to most of us going into lockdown, so we didn't specifically pick up on the coronavirus, but clearly there are some interesting parallels that I know you, my listeners, will be smart enough to work out for yourselves. I found this conversation with Bob Frank to be uplifting and thought-provoking. At a time when we all need a little cheering up, I hope it does the same for you. Bob, welcome to the Human Risk podcast. Thank you so much for joining me. And you're here to talk about your new book, which I thoroughly enjoyed. And I wanted to start by just asking you about the basic idea behind it, which I'll summarise quite simply as saying that peer pressure is very effective. And what you explore in that is how behaviour is contagious and how we can use that to solve quite substantial problems that we're facing as society and as a planet as a whole. And I'm intrigued by what triggered you to sort of think about it in that way and realise that this was potentially a solution to some of the biggest problems we're facing.
You know, it's an old idea, really, Christian. The psychologists have said forever that it's the situation, not the person. And by that, they mean that when we see somebody do something and we try to explain it, our impulse is to say, well, what kind of a person would do such a thing? We think about traits of character and personality. That's barking up the wrong tree, they tell us. If we really want to know why somebody does what she does, we should be thinking instead about the social situation in which she finds herself. So, for example, if you're worried that your teenage daughter will become a smoker, it won't help you one iota to learn that she's a science fiction buff, that she's a sports fan, that she's good in math. None of those things are informative. What you really need to know is the fraction of her close friends who smoke. If that's a big number, she's at risk. If that's a small number, then she's not likely to smoke. And it's a big effect. If her proportion of friends who smoke goes from 20 to 30, for example, she'll become 25% more likely either to become or remain a smoker. So it's one of the biggest influences of all on our behavior. Sometimes for ill, as in that example, but often for good. We also mimic useful behaviors quite often. What's also true, but which rarely gets commented on, is that the social environment that influences us is itself a consequence of the choices we make. So the proportion of smokers out there, that's at least in small part a consequence of whether we decide to smoke or not. But nobody thinks about that when deciding whether to smoke. Oh, I better not. I'll make others more likely to take up the habit. Your own effect on the social environment is too small for it to be worth your while to even worry about. But if there were some way, and this was the key thought that got me working on this project, if there were some way that we could encourage people to behave as if they cared about the effects of their choices on the social environment, that would be a good thing, as long as the things we had to do to get them to do that weren't themselves overly costly. And if you just think about it briefly, it turns out that there are a lot of very simple steps we could take that would induce people to behave as if they cared about their effect on the social environment. And why we haven't pursued those steps systematically over the eons, I have absolutely no idea. It just seems like low-hanging fruit there to be picked.
And that was actually going to be my next question, because when you articulate the way you do, it seems really obvious that we ought to be using this. And in fact, we all know this intuitively in very small ways. If you get in with the wrong crowd, we'll pick up bad habits. And so it seems very surprising to me that there's something we know from an individual perspective, but societally and organizationally, we don't seem to use those same techniques. In fact, we deploy often completely the opposite to those techniques that we know are effective in our own lives. And so I'm fascinated when you say that you have no idea why, because I was really hoping you might have an answer for me.
Well, I've got some tentative thoughts I'll share if you'd like. In the smoking example, I think that's a good one to press further on, because it's so simple and because it's analogous really to most of the other cases we might think about. I wrote a newspaper column for the New York Times talking about why we offered the wrong reasons for our interventions decades ago to discourage smoking. We said, and those interventions occurred closely on the heels of studies from Japan that showed that exposure to secondhand smoke caused illness in the people who were exposed to it. It's true, there are studies that document that effect. And so we offered that as a reason for discouraging people from smoking. It's the standard John Stuart Mill rationale for regulatory intervention. You shouldn't restrict people to prevent them from harming themselves, but it's okay to restrict them, Mill said, to prevent them from causing harm to others, by which he must have meant undue harm, since you can hardly open your mouth without causing some harm to somebody somewhere. So yes, we offered that as a reason, but it turns out that secondhand smoke damage is minuscule compared to the actual damage, not only from being a smoker, but to the damage you cause by making other people around you more likely to smoke. And the pushback I got from people was that, well, yeah, that's true. If more people smoke, that will make others more likely to smoke, but it's not the government's job to intervene there. People have agency. It's up to them to decide which behaviors to copy and which ones to avoid. I really like the sentiment that motivates that objection, but it's not just the people who start smoking who will be injured if I start. It's in addition to that, all the people who care deeply about them. I mean, I've never heard a parent say, I'm guessing you haven't either, that he hopes his kids grow up to be smokers. What a bizarre thing be to hear such a thing. No parent wants his kid, given what we know now. Most smokers don't want to be smokers. They often try to quit, usually unsuccessfully, but parents try every trick in their arsenal to discourage their kids from being smokers. There are only so many tricks they can employ. If they go too far down that road, they'll make their kids more likely to become smokers. So if they've done everything possible and the kid nonetheless starts smoking because you smoked, then you cause that parent real harm. I mean, it's hard to measure the harm. To put a number on it would be difficult, but it wouldn't be impossible. It's no more complex than a lot of other harms we take into account when we decide what policies to adopt. So that's the basic argument. I think people think of these kinds of effects. I call them behavioral externalities. We're in very wide agreement, economists and other policymakers, about traditional externalities, things like smoke, congestion, noise, actions that people take that impose harm on third parties. We're quite comfortable with the idea that we should regulate those kinds of actions or tax them or discourage them in some other way. Behavioral externalities are exactly analogous. There's no reason we should take action in one case and not in the other. And so I think what we see opening up, if you adopt that point of view, is what I've called a policy greenfield. I don't know if the term is familiar. The venture capitalists use it here. The iPhone comes out in 2007, and suddenly scores of new services and products are possible that couldn't have existed beforehand. And so there's a gold rush to develop them. It's the same here. If we actually start thinking systematically about how we might encourage people to behave as if they cared about their effects on the social environment, there are just an enormous number of useful policies we could adopt that would make our lives better.
What I think is really interesting here is that I can see why there's resistance from a governmental perspective, because there would be thought processes around restricting liberties. But if one thinks about organizations and the relationship those organizations have with their employees, there's an ability to influence, and they can get away with far more because people accept the fact that their employer has certain rights over them as an employee. And so I'm very intrigued by the idea that although societally we might struggle to deploy it, organizationally it would seem to me it makes perfect sense because you've got a little bit more control. And yet that still doesn't seem to happen if you look at fields like compliance.
That's a great point. And you're right that the threshold for considering a regulation or a step to influence people's behavior, that's a much lower bar to clear in the case of your employees than it is in the case of government trying to regulate citizens. People, after all, have the right to quit and go seek employment elsewhere if they don't like the terms you're offering. So yes, why haven't we done it there? Great question. I'm not the smartest economist in the world. Why haven't the smarter ones been writing about this for a long time? I don't have an answer to that question.
As ever, when people explain sort of behavioral dynamics to me, it's one of those things where once somebody's pointed out, it becomes very obvious. And I think in this case, it's fascinating to hear you speak about it because as you talk, intuitively, I know that what you're saying makes sense. And that kind of brings me to what you call the mother of all cognitive illusions, which is our behavior towards the environment and the way that we react to that. And you've got some really interesting arguments there. I would love it if you could just summarize those for the listeners because I think they'd be fascinated by it.
Yeah, I think where we stand now in the climate conversation is different from where we were a couple of years ago. I think, at least in the U.S., it may be quite different in the UK, but in the US, we were still battling to get recalcitrant people to accept the fact that there was such a thing as warming taking place and that we had something to do with it and needed to think about how to arrest it. That was the big challenge 2 years ago. I think now people, partly as a result of the dramatic climate events we've been witnessing, people more or less accept that, yes, this is a huge problem. And we do need to do something about it, but we don't have really a very cogent narrative about what to do about it, and whether the things we would need to do to make any difference in the problem would actually be acceptable steps to adopt. So that's where the conversation seems stalled at the moment, and it's easy to see why, because the investments we need to make in order to get emissions down to a level that would actually make a difference in the warming trend would be enormously expensive. In the U.S., we've calculated that it could be done, but the cost would run to something like several $1 trillion a year for many years. We're a $20 trillion economy, so it would be in principle possible to do that. But I think people hear a number like that and they think, oh, it's going to demand awful, painful sacrifices from me, and this problem is still a ways off. Let's think about that tomorrow, not today. That kind of reasoning is quite common. The behavioral contagion theory tells you something interesting about this. It's that the behavior of others influences not just the ways in which we waste energy. It has that effect in spades. When I got married, nobody even knew what a destination wedding was. Now my kids are going to destination bachelor parties. We're buying 7,000-pound vehicles. We're building homes larger than ever in the past. All those things waste energy in ways that, as far as we're able to estimate, serve no useful purpose for the people who are doing them. The happiness literature, or the well-being literature, is very, very voluminous. It's quite contentious, but there are a few findings in it that are more or less robust. And one is that if all the mansions got 50% bigger, let's say they were 10,000 square feet at the moment, somebody waves a magic wand and suddenly the wealthy are living in 15,000 square feet mansions. Well, would the wealthy be happier as a result of that? The most robust finding in this literature is that no, they would not be happier. And I think if we actually could perform the experiment and see what the true answer was, we'd see that they'd be less happier than before, because the bigger mansions are just a lot more bother to take care of. If the only reason you need a bigger one is that others have one, then it's better if none of you builds bigger and we spend those same dollars on things that might make a difference. And we know lots of things that would make a difference. So that's the basic idea. People think that if they were taxed more heavily, it would be harder for them to buy things that they really care about. So if you're a prosperous voter, of course, nobody's proposing that you'll be taxed so heavily that you can't buy what a person might reasonably be said to need. That's not on the table. What are you worried about then? Well, you're fearful that they will tax you enough to keep it impossible for you to buy the special extras that you really want. And if you think about that just briefly, a special extra, what's that mean? It's something that's inherently relative. It's something in short supply. How do you get such things? You must bid against other people like yourself who also want them. And if your taxes go up and their taxes go up too, then your relative bidding power is exactly the same as it was when nobody's taxes had gone up. And so the same penthouse apartments with sweeping 360-degree views of the cities, of which there aren't enough to go around, those units end up in exactly the same hands as before. So the mother of all cognitive illusions is the belief, widely shared, that if I pay substantially more in taxes, it's going to make my life more difficult. I'll have to give up things I care about. But in fact, that's a false belief. The reason people cling to it is that if they try to think about the effect of higher taxes, in the U.S. at any rate, the normal, or anywhere, the normal way you would think about a question like that is to think back to the last time the event happened. How did you feel then? That strategy doesn't work in the current environment because top marginal tax rates have been falling steadily ever since World War II. They were 92% at the top then. They're now 37%. There have been almost no interruptions in the decline between those two numbers. And so you can't assess the effect of higher taxes by thinking in the usual way about them. So what do you do instead? Well, you know that higher taxes mean you're going to have less disposable income. That's clearly true. So you think back to times when you had less income. Even if you've led a highly charmed life, there will be times like that in your history. So maybe you had a business reverse, a divorce, a losing lawsuit, maybe a health crisis, a home fire. There are things that happen to everyone that reduce their incomes. Each of the memories of those things is vivid. It's unpleasant. You don't want things like that to happen again. And you think that's how you would feel if your taxes went up. But what you don't notice, and it's perfectly natural that you wouldn't, is that when those events happen, they reduce your income, but they have no effect on the incomes of your peers. And so your relative bidding power really does go down in the wake of events like that. But it would not go down if your taxes went up and the taxes of others like you also went up. And that's the illusion. I call it the mother of all cognitive illusions because here in the U.S., it's prevented us for decades from making the kinds of investments in our crumbling infrastructure that we need to make. It's prevented us from adding any significant new infrastructure, and now, most critically, it's keeping us from making the investments that we need to make in order to parry the climate threat. It's a hugely costly cognitive illusion.
And thinking again about the sort of the political will and ability to implement some of these ideas, I mean, the biggest challenge here is going to be that this requires a shift. And it requires a sort of shift in understanding and acceptance by society. And there is the very obvious counter-argument that I know you can dismantle, but I'll raise it anyway just so that we can address this issue, which is if you put taxes up in a particular jurisdiction, say the US, then all that will happen, the logic goes, is that people will go to lower tax jurisdictions to escape the punitive charge. And so the whole proposal you're suggesting falls apart.
Yeah, that's the inevitable charge you will hear in response to a proposal like this. That's, in fact, the charge that former Governor Jerry Brown of California heard when he proposed raising the top marginal tax rate on the state's highest earners. And the state was in a budget crisis. Their public services were in disarray. The infrastructure was crumbling. The years of tax cutting had so depleted public budgets that they couldn't keep up with the investments they needed to make. He told his voters, we're going to need to raise revenue to restore these projects that we've let lie fallow for so long. People complained. People predicted that the wealthy would leave the state in droves. They did it. They raised the top tax rate by fully 50%. That's a huge increase. And lo and behold, Stanford University, a few years later, published a study showing that the top 1% of earners in California left the state at a far lower rate than anyone else anywhere along the income ladder. They left less often than the 98th percentile, than the 97th percent, all the way down. Nobody left less often than the top 1%. They're successful in California. They have embedded lives that work very well for them. Being successful at heart means being successful relative to your rivals with whom you compete most closely, and the higher taxes they were paying made absolutely no difference in their relative standing in the community. And at the same time, they got to drive their luxury cars on roads that were much better maintained instead of roads that were riddled with foot-deep potholes. There was absolutely no reason for them to look at that move as having reduced the quality of their lives in any way. On the contrary, it made their lives better.
And I'm struck when we think about political willingness to engage with this. I mean, if at the moment you were to go to someone and say, look, the solution here is for you to soak the rich with taxes, surely even if they accepted your arguments, that's quite unpalatable as a strategy. And so one of the things I was wondering is there any room to use the techniques that you've highlighted to be able to persuade politicians to shift the general perception of acceptability around raising taxes in the way you suggest?
Well, first of all, we know that big and rapid shifts in public views about much more highly charged issues than this one have occurred in history many times. I think the shift in attitudes toward same-sex marriage is instructive here. In 2008, both Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton came out publicly against a California referendum that would have legalized same-sex marriage. It had already been legalized in many other states by then. Just a few years later, 2015, the Supreme Court issued its ruling that legalized same-sex marriage in every state. Now, virtually every state in the union has a very strong majority of people saying, yes, we should permit people to marry whomever they please. That's a extraordinarily rapid shift on a very, very sensitive topic. It's still in many parts of the world illegal to marry somebody of the opposite sex. You can be put to death for being a homosexual in some countries. So to see an attitude change that rapidly is really quite convincing proof that it can happen. What we know too, well, we've got in our political dynamic at the moment, we've got at least two billionaires competing for the Democratic presidential nomination. If either one of them hired Pixar Studios, the fabled animation producers, to make a 10-minute video explaining the mother of cognitive illusions to voters and then ran it for 2 weeks on popular television programs, the illusion would be a thing of the past. It's not a complicated illusion. It's natural that people don't think of things in those terms, but if you've got a middle schooler in your household, try it out on that child. See if you can't explain why wealthy people would tend to overestimate the pain they'd experience if their taxes went up. It's an idea anyone can understand on brief explanation. So yeah, we could change people's minds about this. And then as more people say, yes, this is something we ought to do, that makes it safer for others to make a similar statement. We've seen that dynamic play out again and again too.
And what I think is really interesting here is that on the one hand, we'd like to believe that we're getting more sophisticated as a species, that people have more information than ever before, that they are becoming more sophisticated. And yet, if you look at what lands, particularly from a political perspective, whether that's here in the UK in relation to Brexit or the kind of messaging that Trump is delivering, actually, it seems to be really simple messages that cut through and that are more persuasive. And so I loved your articulation around Pixar, because the way they work is they get to us emotionally. And so it seems to me this is not about turning up and making logical arguments. This is about kind of using emotional engagement to persuade people to change their mind on what looks like really big, intractable issues.
Right. Yeah, I think we are learning more as researchers study this. We're learning more about how to make progress when we talk to people who have opposing views. It's a challenge, to be sure, but we're getting better at least in terms of the theoretical knowledge we've been piling up about how better to approach that problem. And one of the main findings in that literature is that trying to just get somebody to adopt your point of view straight away is a very unsuccessful technique for making contact with people in an opposing camp. Much better is just to talk with them, listen to their concerns, and best of all, try to pose the right questions. The literature on learning theory has shown again and again that if you can somehow ask a question that leads someone to discover a concept for herself, that's vastly more effective than simply trying to explain it to her. It's part of the Western philosophical tradition ever since Socrates that we've, at least some of us have known this, but I think we just don't put that basic truth into practice often enough.
If we look at the world nowadays, one of the things that people talk about is polarization and tribes. And clearly one can see that part of the reason that happens is some of the dynamics you described. We have an in-crowd, maybe an echo chamber. And so I find it really interesting that on the one hand, the dynamic you're talking about is the thing that causes the problem. And yet it's also the thing that we could potentially use to correct that polarization in there. And then the other bit I like is that you talk about it as if it's very, very simple. And you're saying, look, it's a really simple piece. And it's, we could just deploy this and we could get the outcomes that we're looking for on these big issues, which simultaneously depresses and fascinates me.
Yeah, the most vivid example in my own experience, I would frequently have conversations when the Affordable Care Act was under debate. That is the measure known as Obamacare. It tried to expand health coverage in the U.S., which is something we've lagged notoriously on ever since people started keeping records about what countries do what on that issue. But the opponents of Obamacare were actually supportive of some of the provisions of it. They liked the requirement, for example, that insurance companies had to offer coverage to people even with serious pre-existing medical conditions, and they had to offer those policies at rates the same as other people would pay. Everybody liked that. What the opponents of Obamacare hated was the fact that the government also required you to buy a policy. If you didn't buy a policy, you were assessed a fine. That was a gross usurpation of their individual rights, many of them felt. You could, and the sponsors of the act did try to explain patiently why you had to have that feature if you were going to make an orderly insurance market, but those explanations never seemed to go anywhere. What I discovered in my own conversations with opponents of Obamacare, and I discovered it quite by accident, was that if you just asked a very simple question, things seem to unfold completely differently. So what I would ask people is, what do you think would happen if the government required home insurers to sell fire insurance policies to people after their homes had already burned down, policies at the same affordable rates they offer now to people after their homes had already burned down? You don't need to think very long about that, and people didn't before they would immediately volunteer. Wow, if the government did that, home insurance would go bankrupt in short order. They'd have to replace $500,000 homes with policies that they'd sold for only a couple of $100s. They couldn't do that. And then without any prompting at all, people would make the short step from there to see that, wow, the patient with pre-existing conditions, that's a patient whose care can cost millions of dollars a year, that patient is exactly like the guy whose home has already burned down. You can't require the insurer to cover that guy unless you have some other means to make sure everyone else is in the pool. And if insurance companies didn't know that most of the houses they insured wouldn't burn down, they just couldn't offer coverage to people whose houses did burn down. But for somebody to discover that on their own, much more effective than if you try to explain it to them.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, one of the arguments people might use against that would be to say, well, why should I, as a healthy individual, put money into a pot that will pay for someone else? It's a very self-serving, selfish argument, but that seems to be the kind of logic that people who don't like this idea are deploying. And yet we all know intuitively that we perform better. We're a kind of herd social species, and we're better protected when we work together. So we recognize that benefit. And, I love your talking about saying, you can have a great car, but if the roads are terrible, it really doesn't help you. And having that backstop is clearly something that intuitively all know makes a lot of sense, yet people seem to reject it. And so there's an interesting tension here, which is, on the one hand, we recognize that we're part of something broader. On the other hand, there is this sort of selfish self-interest that seems to drive a lot of our thinking.
If you look at what most countries do, they tax their citizens and use the revenue to provide health coverage for everybody. They don't say, do you want to pay tax to support this? That's not a question that you're ever asked. It's just something that you have to do. Are they violating your freedom? Well, nobody ever has made a cogent argument to the effect that it's up to you individually how much tax you ought to pay. That's a question that we relegate to our elected leaders. They have to have deliberations and then decide on a tax rate and how much different activities should be taxed and for what purposes. So if there is no alternative to a step like that, you can't legitimately claim that your freedom has been violated. If you're in a system like ours where buying health insurance is voluntary, the government doesn't step in, and you don't buy health insurance because you're healthy, you make it harder for other people to buy health insurance. We have seen unraveling here, but it's called the death spiral. As healthy people drop out of the pool because rates go higher and higher, that makes rates go higher still, and it becomes quickly impossible for anybody with even a minor pre-existing condition to buy health insurance. So if your behavior makes it impossible for an innocent person with a pre-existing condition to find health coverage, are you not causing harm to that person? It seems to me clear that you are. And even if you're then a John Stuart Mill libertarian, the only reason the government can make me do something is to prevent me from causing undue harm to others. That sounds like it meets that test. So yeah, I don't see those arguments as having much force, to tell you the honest truth.
And final question from me: a lot of my listeners work in compliance or risk and have to influence other people's behavior and decision making as part of their role. What advice would you give them in terms of channeling some of these sort of social pressures to get the contagion effect that you've talked about?
What's worked for us in the public domain also can work in the private domain. So you can offer little fees and little rewards or subsidies for steering behavior in the direction that you'd like to see it go. What we know too is that in research that's been done in the school system, to try to identify ways to limit the extent of bullying, students who are identified using social network data as being central players in the school social network, if those players will speak up and go on record publicly as saying bullying is not something that we support, we should not be doing this, that has a dramatically larger effect on the behavior of others than if others speak up. So I think being strategic in your choice of how to get the message out that you're trying to get out is another part of the picture. But no, we can do many of the same things that have worked in the public domain.
Well, I think that is a beautifully uplifting message, and in a world where there's lots of negativity, I think that's a lovely way on which to finish the podcast. And I did want to say that I found your book tremendously uplifting, because I think it paints a really simple way for us to solve a whole heap of problems that traditional methods haven't necessarily been able to resolve. And so as I was reading it and smiling and nodding and thinking, this is all very obvious, I was filled with a real sense of positivity, because you engaged with me in a level that made sense and I understood. So I highly recommend it to listeners to read anyway. But I think it's a very joyous, uplifting read, because it really does suggest that we can solve some of these problems. So thank you for writing the book and doing the research. And above all, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure.
You know, I don't have to tell you that it makes me very happy to hear you say things like that. And as my Princeton University Press publicist said to me recently, this is the most challenging media climate ever in recent memory to try to launch a book into. So it's hard for a book's message to get out in this climate, and help from people like you is much appreciated. So thanks so much, Christian, for letting me talk to your listeners.
So that's it for another episode. My thanks to Bob for appearing and to you for listening. You'll find details of his book, Under the Influence, in the show notes, together with other useful links. If you're not already subscribed to the Human Risk Podcast, you'll find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all the usual podcasting platforms. As ever, if you enjoyed the show and had a couple of minutes to leave a review, that helps me to raise the profile of the show and allows me to continue to attract high-quality guests like Bob. Thank you so much for listening. Please stay safe and remember to be kind to each other. New episodes of this podcast are coming very soon.